Lady Margaret Whitmore stepped out of her gleaming black car at the gates of Buckingham Palace, her designer heels clicking against the pavement, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. At 35, she was the wife of a wealthy businessman and had grown accustomed to getting her way in every situation. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning sunlight as she adjusted her expensive silk scarf, a gesture that had become second nature whenever she wanted to remind others of her status. The palace tour was something she had arranged through her husband's connections, bypassing the usual waiting lists that common people had to endure. Margaret believed she deserved special treatment, and today was no different. She walked with her small group of similarly privileged friends, her chin held high as she surveyed the magnificent architecture around her. The tour guide, a polite, young woman in a navy uniform, led them through the staterooms while explaining the history and significance of various artifacts. Margaret barely listened, instead focusing on how she might use this experience to impress others at her next dinner party. She had already planned to casually mention her private palace tour, emphasizing how easily she had secured such exclusive access. As they moved through the corridors, Margaret's attention was caught by the ceremonial guards stationed at various points throughout the palace. These were not the famous red-coated beefeaters that tourists typically photographed, but rather the Queen's Guard in their traditional uniforms, standing perfectly still with their weapons at their sides. Their discipline and dedication to their duty was evident in their unwavering posture, but to Margaret, they appeared as nothing more than decorative elements of the palace experience. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the ornate carpeting. As the group continued their tour, Margaret found herself growing bored with the guide's explanations about paintings and furniture. She was used to being the center of attention, and the structured nature of the tour left her feeling restless and overlooked. Her friends seemed genuinely interested in the historical details, but Margaret's mind began to wander toward finding a way to make this experience more memorable and exciting. She noticed how other visitors showed deep respect for the surroundings, speaking in hushed tones and maintaining appropriate distance from the guards and artifacts. This restraint puzzled Margaret, who had always believed that rules were suggestions rather than requirements, especially for someone of her social standing. The seed of her fateful decision was already beginning to take root, as she observed the solemn dedication of the guards and the reverent behavior of her fellow visitors. The palace felt alive with centuries of history and tradition, but Margaret saw it differently than everyone else in her group. Where others saw sacred duty and honor, she saw an opportunity to assert her perceived superiority and create a story that would cement her reputation as someone who dared to do what others would not. Little did she know that her next impulsive decision would change everything about how she viewed herself and her place in the world. The group had moved into the throne room when Margaret's restlessness reached its peak. The ornate golden chairs and crimson carpet should have inspired awe, but instead, she felt an overwhelming urge to do something that would set her apart from the other tourists shuffling quietly through the space. Her eyes wandered from the elaborate ceiling to the guards stationed around the perimeter, their presence both commanding and seemingly vulnerable to someone who had never respected boundaries. Standing near the entrance to the room was guard Thomas Mitchell, a 28-year-old man who had served His Majesty's forces with distinction for over 8 years. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his ceremonial sword hung at his side as a symbol of his oath to protect the crown. Thomas had been selected for palace duty based on his exemplary record and unwavering dedication to protocol. He had trained extensively for situations involving difficult visitors, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. Margaret excused herself from her group, claiming she wanted to get a better look at the portraits along the wall. In reality, she had spotted Guard Mitchell and decided that photographing herself next to him would make for an impressive social media post. She approached him with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, pulling out her expensive phone and positioning herself beside the motionless guard. The first few photos were standard tourist shots, but they failed to satisfy Margaret's need for something more dramatic. She noticed other visitors glancing at her with what she interpreted as admiration for her boldness, though their expressions actually showed concern and disapproval. Encouraged by the attention, Margaret decided to take her photo opportunity to the next level. Without warning or permission, she reached out and placed her hand on Guard Mitchell's arm, leaning against him as if he were a prop rather than a human being performing his sacred duty. The guard's training kicked in immediately, and he remained perfectly still despite the inappropriate contact, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as protocol demanded. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of his internal struggle, to maintain composure in the face of such disrespect. Margaret noticed his stillness and mistook it for compliance rather than professional restraint. The lack of reaction emboldened her further, and she began to pose more dramatically, even going so far as to adjust his uniform slightly for what she considered a better photographic composition. Other visitors had stopped to watch the scene unfold, some pulling out their own phones to record what was clearly becoming an inappropriate spectacle. The tour guide noticed the disturbance and began making her way toward Margaret, but the distance across the large room meant she would need several moments to intervene. Meanwhile, Margaret's friends called out to her in hushed but urgent tones, trying to signal that she should return to the group immediately. Their embarrassment was evident in their expressions, but Margaret was too caught up in her perceived moment of triumph to recognize their distress. As she prepared to take what she planned would be her final and most daring photograph, Margaret's eyes fell upon the ceremonial sword at Guard Mitchell's side. The weapon gleamed in the afternoon light, its polished surface reflecting the grandeur of the surrounding room. In that moment, an idea formed in her mind that would transform her from merely disrespectful to dangerously reckless, setting the stage for consequences she could never have imagined. The moment Margaret's fingers wrapped around the hilt of Guard Mitchell's ceremonial sword, time seemed to freeze in the throne room. The weight of the weapon surprised her as she attempted to lift it from its scabbard, but her determination to create the ultimate photograph overrode any common sense that might have stopped her. The sword moved only inches before Guard Mitchell's training and protective instincts took complete control of the situation. In one fluid motion that demonstrated years of military precision, Thomas Mitchell's hand clamped down on Margaret's wrist with controlled but unmistakable authority. His other hand secured his weapon while his body shifted to block her access to any other part of his equipment. For the first time since entering the palace, his eyes moved from their fixed forward position to look directly at the woman who had just committed what could be considered an act of aggression against a royal guard. Margaret gasped in shock as she found herself unable to move her arm or release the sword hilt. The strength in the guard's grip was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and suddenly the reality of her situation began to dawn on her. This was not a posed mannequin or a tourist attraction, but a trained soldier whose primary duty was to protect the crown and maintain security in one of the most important buildings in the nation. The entire room fell silent as other visitors witnessed the confrontation unfolding before them. Phones appeared from every direction as people began recording what was clearly going to become a viral moment, though not in the way Margaret had originally intended. Her carefully planned photo opportunity had transformed into a public humiliation that would soon be broadcast across social media platforms around the world. Within seconds, additional guards materialized from positions throughout the room that Margaret had never even noticed. Their approach was swift and coordinated, demonstrating the level of security that had been invisibly present throughout her entire visit. These were not ceremonial figures, but active duty personnel trained to respond to threats with speed and efficiency. Guard Mitchell's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but carried an authority that cut through Margaret's shocked protestations. He informed her that she had committed a serious breach of security protocol and that her actions would need to be reported through proper channels. His words were professional and measured, but the underlying message was clear. Her behavior had crossed a line that could have serious legal consequences. Margaret's friends watched in horror from across the room as palace security personnel approached their group. The tour guide, now accompanied by senior staff members, wore an expression of professional concern, mixed with barely concealed frustration. What should have been a routine tour had been disrupted by actions that showed complete disregard for the sanctity and security of the royal residence. As additional security measures were implemented around the room, Margaret finally released her grip on the sword hilt. But the damage had already been done. Her attempt to assert dominance and create a memorable photo had instead resulted in her being identified as a potential security threat in one of the most heavily monitored buildings in the country. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in as she realized that her actions would have consequences far beyond anything she had ever experienced in her privileged life. The whispers from other visitors grew louder as people shared their shock at witnessing such disrespectful behavior in the heart of the British monarchy. Margaret's face flushed red as she began to understand that she had not impressed anyone with her boldness, but had instead revealed herself to be someone willing to disrespect traditions and security protocols that others held sacred. Palace security moved with practiced efficiency, as Margaret found herself surrounded by personnel whose demeanor left no room for the kind of entitled behavior she had displayed throughout her life. Chief Security Officer James Harrison, a stern man in his 50s with decades of experience protecting the royal family, arrived on the scene within minutes of the incident. His presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation, from a tourist disruption to a formal security breach investigation. Margaret's attempts to explain her actions as a harmless photo opportunity fell on deaf ears as Officer Harrison reviewed the preliminary reports from the guards who had witnessed the event. The ceremonial sword she had attempted to draw was not merely a decorative piece, but a functional weapon that represented centuries of military tradition and royal protection. Her unauthorized contact with both the guard and his equipment constituted multiple violations of security protocols that were taken extremely seriously by palace authorities. The other members of Margaret's tour group were questioned separately about their relationship to her and whether they had any knowledge of her intentions to disrupt the visit. Her friends, deeply embarrassed by the association, distanced themselves from her actions while expressing their shock at her behavior. They explained to investigators that Margaret had always been impulsive and demanding, but none of them had anticipated she would do something so reckless and disrespectful. As Margaret was escorted to a private room for questioning, she passed through corridors lined with portraits of monarchs and military leaders who had dedicated their lives to service and duty. The irony was lost on her as she continued to insist that her actions had been misunderstood and that her social position should excuse her behavior. Her demands to speak with her husband or her lawyer were noted, but did not change the systematic process that had been triggered by her actions. The questioning revealed the depth of Margaret's entitlement and her complete lack of understanding about the significance of royal protocol and security measures. She repeatedly emphasized her social connections and financial status, apparently believing these factors would minimize the consequences of her actions. Security officers documented her responses with professional detachment, building a comprehensive record of both the incident and her attitude toward it. Meanwhile, news of the confrontation had already begun spreading through social media as other visitors shared videos and photos of the dramatic scene in the throne room. The images showed Margaret's shocked expression as Guard Mitchell maintained his professional composure while restraining her access to his weapon. Comments poured in from people around the world expressing their outrage at her disrespectful behavior and their admiration for the guard's handling of the situation. Guard Mitchell, whose dedication to duty had prevented what could have been a much more serious security incident, was required to provide a detailed written report of the encounter. His account emphasized the speed and determination with which Margaret had reached for his sword, actions that in different circumstances could have been interpreted as a genuine threat to palace security. The formal language of his report transformed Margaret's impulsive photo opportunity into an official record of aggressive behavior toward a royal guard. The palace legal team was consulted about potential charges ranging from assault on a royal guard to breaching security protocols in a protected building. Margaret's actions had not only disrupted the tour and disrespected Guard Mitchell, but had also created a security situation that required the attention of multiple departments and personnel. The cost of her few moments of entitled behavior was beginning to compound in ways she had never imagined possible. As the investigation continued, Margaret sat in the security office facing the growing realization that her wealth and social status would not shield her from the consequences of her actions. The professional courtesy she was accustomed to receiving had been replaced by the systematic accountability that governed one of the most important institutions in the nation. The viral spread of Margaret's palace incident exceeded anything she could have imagined when she first reached for that ceremonial sword. Within hours, the videos captured by other tourists had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, accompanied by hashtags that mocked her entitled behavior and praised Guard Mitchell's professional response. News outlets picked up the story, transforming Margaret from an unknown socialite into a symbol of privilege and disrespect that resonated with people around the world. Margaret's husband, Richard Whitmore, received the first calls about his wife's behavior while he was in an important business meeting. The embarrassment of having to explain that his wife had assaulted a royal guard and attempted to steal a ceremonial sword was compounded by the immediate impact on his professional reputation. Business associates who had previously sought his company now wondered about the judgment and character of someone married to a person capable of such public misconduct. The legal consequences began to materialize as palace authorities decided to pursue formal charges against Margaret. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the case and determined that her actions warranted prosecution under multiple statutes, including assault on a public official, breach of security in a protected building, and disturbing the peace. The weight of the British legal system, with its deep respect for royal institutions and traditions, would now focus its attention on her brief moment of reckless behavior. Margaret's lawyer, hastily hired by her increasingly frustrated husband, attempted to negotiate a settlement or plea arrangement that would minimize the public exposure of a trial. However, the viral nature of the incident and the clear video evidence made it difficult to dispute the facts of what had occurred. The lawyer's attempts to portray the incident as a misunderstanding were undermined by Margaret's own recorded statements expressing her belief that she had the right to do whatever she wanted during her palace visit. The social consequences proved to be as devastating as the legal ones. Margaret's circle of wealthy friends began distancing themselves from her, as the incident reflected poorly on their entire social group. Invitations to exclusive events were quietly rescinded, and her membership in several prestigious organizations came under review. The very social status she had been so eager to display and enhance was now crumbling under the weight of her public humiliation. Media interviews with Guard Mitchell revealed the personal impact of Margaret's actions on someone who had dedicated his life to service and duty. His dignified responses to questions about the incident contrasted sharply with Margaret's entitled behavior, earning him widespread admiration and support. A fund established by grateful citizens to honor his professionalism raised significant money for military charities, turning him into an unexpected symbol of dedication and integrity. Margaret found herself confined to her home as photographers, and reporters camped outside, eager to capture any glimpse of the woman who had become internationally known for her disrespectful behavior. Her attempts to venture out were met with recognition from strangers who had seen the viral videos, leading to uncomfortable confrontations and further embarrassment. The privacy and anonymity she had previously enjoyed were now permanently compromised by her moment of poor judgment. The psychological toll of becoming a global symbol of entitled behavior began to weigh heavily on Margaret as she realized the full scope of what she had lost. Her marriage faced strain as her husband dealt with the professional and social consequences of her actions, while her own sense of identity was shattered by the universal condemnation she received. The confident, entitled woman who had walked into Buckingham Palace was being replaced by someone forced to confront the reality of her character and choices. As her court date approached, Margaret's legal team prepared for a trial that would be closely watched by media around the world. The simple photo opportunity she had envisioned had evolved into a legal and personal nightmare that threatened to define the rest of her life, demonstrating the severe consequences that could result from a few moments of unchecked privilege and disrespect. The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious members of the public on the day of Margaret's trial, all eager to witness the conclusion of a case that had captured international attention. Margaret, dressed conservatively in stark contrast to her usual flamboyant style, sat beside her lawyer as prosecutors presented video evidence of her assault on Guard Mitchell and her attempt to remove his ceremonial sword. The footage, played repeatedly for the jury, showed clearly her aggressive actions and complete disregard for protocol and respect. Guard Mitchell's testimony proved to be the most compelling part of the proceedings. Speaking with quiet dignity about his 8 years of service and his commitment to protecting the crown, he described how Margaret's actions had not only violated security protocols, but had also shown profound disrespect for the traditions and values he had sworn to uphold. His measured responses to cross-examination attempts to minimize the incident only served to highlight the seriousness of Margaret's behavior and her complete lack of remorse. The defense strategy of portraying Margaret as someone who had simply made a mistake while caught up in the excitement of visiting the palace fell flat when prosecutors presented evidence of her social media posts and statements to friends about her intention to do something memorable and attention-grabbing during her visit. Her pattern of entitled behavior and disregard for rules became clear as witnesses testified about previous incidents where she had demanded special treatment and ignored established protocols. Margaret's own testimony proved to be the most damaging part of her defense. Despite her lawyer's coaching, she could not hide her fundamental belief that her wealth and social status should have exempted her from the consequences of her actions. Her attempts to justify grabbing the sword as harmless fun, and her continued insistence that the guards had overreacted, revealed to the jury the depth of her entitlement and lack of genuine understanding about the seriousness of her offense. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous. Margaret was found guilty on all charges, including assault on a public official, breach of security in a protected building, and disturbing the peace. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the importance of respecting institutions that represented centuries of tradition and the service of individuals like Guard Mitchell, who dedicated their lives to protecting those traditions. Margaret received a substantial fine, community service hours, and a permanent ban from all royal properties. The aftermath of the trial brought no relief for Margaret, as she discovered that her legal troubles were only the beginning of her long journey back to any semblance of respectability. Her husband filed for divorce, citing the irreparable damage to his business and social relationships caused by her actions. The settlement left her financially secure but socially isolated, as her former friends and associates continued to distance themselves from the scandal that had consumed her life. Guard Mitchell returned to his duties with enhanced respect from his colleagues and the public, becoming a symbol of professionalism and dedication in the face of disrespectful behavior. He used his unexpected fame to advocate for better support of military personnel and the importance of respecting those who served their country. His dignity throughout the ordeal contrasted sharply with Margaret's continued attempts to justify her actions and blame others for her situation. Margaret eventually moved to a different country, hoping to escape the recognition and judgment that followed her everywhere in Britain. The woman who had once believed that rules did not apply to her had learned through bitter experience that actions have consequences, regardless of wealth or perceived social status. Her brief moment of entitled behavior at Buckingham Palace had cost her marriage, social standing, and reputation, serving as a powerful reminder that respect for others and their duties cannot be bought or negotiated away. Years later, the incident remained a cautionary tale shared in discussions about privilege, respect, and the importance of understanding that certain boundaries exist for everyone, regardless of their position in society. Margaret's name became synonymous with entitled behavior, while Guard Mitchell's professional response continued to be celebrated as an example of dedication and honor in the face of unprecedented disrespect.